Sarah Miller adjusted her apron for the third time that morning, her hands trembling slightly, as she prepared yet another cup of coffee. The corner diner was busier than usual, but she could barely focus on the customers' orders. 3 days ago, her father had come home with a grey face and shaking hands, carrying a stack of documents that would change their lives forever. "Honey, I messed up bad," were the words he managed to utter before collapsing into a kitchen chair. The delivery app project he had developed with such enthusiasm had completely failed. Worse, the investor who had sunk $250,000 into the project wasn't willing to accept failure as an answer. Sarah served the coffee to a distracted customer, her mind constantly returning to the documents she had read the night before. It wasn't just a matter of debt. There were clauses of criminal liability, accusations of negligence and mismanagement of funds. Her father, a man of pure heart but naive to business, had signed a contract that could destroy not only his reputation, but also his freedom. Across town, on the 45th floor of the most imposing building in Manhattan, Alexander Sterling adjusted his leather gloves for the 4th time in 10 minutes. The meeting with the board had ended half an hour ago, but their words still echoed in his mind like an inevitable ultimatum. "Alexander, you need a wife. The merger with the Germans depends on your public image. They're conservative, traditional. A single man at 34 worries them." He observed the city below through the glass walls of his penthouse, a world that seemed as distant as the moon. Every surface around him gleamed with the obsessive sterilization that had become his personal prison. Hand sanitizer dispensers dotted every wall like silent soldiers in his war against the outside world. The phobia had started when he was 8 years old, the day his mother died in his arms from a hospital infection. Since then, every human touch was a reminder of that loss, every physical contact, a risk that his brain simply couldn't process. His fortune had been built through screens and intermediaries, an empire commanded from a distance by a man who couldn't shake the hands of his own employees. His assistant, Robert, entered the room, maintaining his usual respectful distance. "Mr. Sterling, I've brought the documents for the Miller project that you requested. The man is 4 months in arrears and the criminal charges were formalized yesterday." Alexander took the papers with his gloves on, his eyes quickly scanning the information. David Miller, 52 years old, a 24-year-old daughter named Sarah. The project had been too ambitious for a man without business experience, but Alexander had bet on him out of sheer boredom, a small diversion amidst million-dollar deals. "Where does the daughter work?" he asked, an idea beginning to form in his calculating mind. "At a diner in Greenwich Village, sir." "The corner diner. It seems she's trying to help her father with the finances." Alexander closed his eyes for a moment, his brain processing the possibilities. He needed a wife who wouldn't touch him, who would respect his limitations, someone who had enough reason to maintain the agreement without questioning, someone who understood that this would only be a contract, not a real marriage. "Schedule a meeting with Ms. Miller for tomorrow at 2 in the afternoon, he said, his voice taking on the cold, decisive tone he used for all his business dealings. "And Robert, bring the documents for the prenuptial agreement that my lawyer prepared last year. I'll need a few modifications." Sarah received the call during her lunch break, Alexander's assistant's formal voice leaving her completely confused. Her meeting to discuss her father's financial situation at Sterling Holdings. The address was one of the most expensive buildings in the city, a place where people like her simply didn't belong. That night, she told her father about the call, watching as the little color that remained in his face disappeared completely. "Sarah, this man, he can destroy us," muttered David, his hands trembling as he held the cup of tea she had prepared. "I researched him after everything went wrong. Alexander Sterling is ruthless in business. He's already destroyed companies much larger than ours for much less." Sarah arrived at the Sterling Holdings building 15 minutes early, her sweaty, hands clutching the strap of the simple purse she had borrowed from her neighbor. The white marble lobby looked like a temple dedicated to success, with its imposing columns and the reverent silence of the well-dressed employees who passed by like efficient ghosts. The elevator took her to the 45th floor in a silent glide that made her stomach churn. When the doors opened, she found herself in a hallway that looked more like a hospital, all white, antiseptic, with a slightly chemical smell in the air. Hand sanitizer dispensers dotted the walls at regular intervals as if they were modern works of art. Robert, the assistant, greeted her, maintaining a respectful distance. "Ms. Miller, Mr. Sterling will see you in a few minutes. Please wait here." He indicated a white leather chair that looked like it had never been used, in a waiting room that looked more like a laboratory. Sarah sat on the edge of the chair, observing every detail of the room. There were no magazines, plants, or anything that seemed to have been touched by human hands. Everything shone with an artificial perfection that made her feel like she was a contamination in that immaculate space. "Ms. Miller!" The voice made her jump. Robert had returned, wearing latex gloves that she hadn't noticed before. "Mr. Sterling will see you now." Alexander's office was even more impressive than the lobby. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls offered the panoramic view of Manhattan, while the interior was dominated by a stainless steel desk that looked like it had been designed for surgeries. Behind it, a young-looking man stood up slowly. Sarah recognized him immediately from the business magazines she occasionally saw at the diner. Alexander Sterling was taller than she imagined, with perfectly groomed dark hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to calculate her every move. He wore an impeccable suit, and she noted with surprise thin leather gloves that molded perfectly to his hands. "Ms. Miller," he said, his deep voice echoing in the spacious room. He made no mention of shaking her hand, remaining behind the desk as if it were a protective barrier. "I imagine your father has informed you about the situation." "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, her own voice sounding strange in the oppressive silence. "He told me that the project didn't work out and that there are legal consequences involved." Alexander nodded, his eyes never leaving her face. $250,000, Miss Miller, in addition to criminal charges for mismanagement and negligence. Your father could face up to 5 years in prison." The words hit Sarah like a punch to the stomach. 5 years. She saw the image of her father behind bars, a gentleman who had only dreamed too big, being destroyed by his own naivete. "But," Alexander continued, his voice taking on an even more calculating tone, "I have a proposal that can solve all these problems." Sarah watched him suspiciously. "What kind of proposal?" "I need a wife," he said so directly that she blinked several times, thinking she had misheard. "Not a real wife, mind you. A business arrangement, a 1-year marriage, contract to satisfy certain professional requirements." "I don't understand," Sarah murmured, her mind struggling to process what she was hearing. Alexander moved to the side of the desk but maintained his distance. "My board requires me to have a more conventional public image to complete a major merger. You need the debt and the charges against your father to disappear. It's a simple and mutually beneficial exchange." "Are you asking me to marry you?" The question came out louder than she intended, echoing in the sterile office. "Only on paper," Alexander replied, his voice maintaining its cold, professional tone. "You would live in my penthouse, attend a few social events when necessary, and in return not only would the debt be forgiven, but your father would receive a substantial sum to start over. No criminal charges, no prison, no consequences." Sarah felt her legs grow weak. "And if I refuse, then the legal process will run its normal course. Your father will be tried, probably convicted, and you will lose everything you still own to cover the debts and legal costs." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah looked at Alexander's gloved hands, at his cold eyes that seemed to calculate her every reaction, at the aseptic environment that seemed to suck all the life out of the air. She thought of her father at home, probably pacing back and forth, in the kitchen, blaming himself for ruining their lives. "How long do I have to decide?" she asked, her voice coming out as a whisper. "Until noon tomorrow," Alexander replied, returning to his position behind the desk. "Robert will escort you to the exit and give you my card. When you make your decision, call the direct number." Sarah rose on trembling legs, each step towards the door feeling like an eternity. On the threshold, she turned to look at him one last time. Alexander remained motionless behind his steel desk, a solitary figure in his kingdom of glass and asepsis, and for a moment She thought she saw something beyond the calculating coldness in his eyes, a deep loneliness that mirrored her own. Sarah spent the entire night pacing the small apartment she shared with her father, her hands trembling every time she held Alexander's card. The direct number was printed in gold letters on paper that seemed to cost more than her monthly salary. She had told her father everything, watching as he aged 10 years in a few minutes. "Honey, I can't let you do this for my sake," David said, his voice broken. "Marrying a stranger, living in a world, that isn't ours, and that's too much to ask." "Dad, it's just a year," Sarah replied, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "And you heard what he said. It's just a contract. It's not a real marriage." But even as she spoke, she remembered Alexander's cold eyes, the way he kept away from her as if she were a contagious disease. There was something deeply disturbing about that man, an invisible barrier that seemed impossible to cross. The next morning, Sarah called the number at 11:55. Her voice was steady when she said, "I accept." 3 weeks later, she was standing before a judge in the most elegant courthouse in Manhattan, wearing a simple white dress that Alexander had sent to her house. The ceremony was cold and efficient, witnessed only by Robert and a lawyer that Sarah had never seen before. Alexander kept his gloves on throughout the procedure, and when it came time to exchange rings, he slid hers over his glove before placing it on her finger, avoiding any skin-to-skin contact. "You may kiss the bride," said the judge, and Sarah saw Alexander freeze completely. For a moment that seemed like an eternity. He just looked at her and she realized that his hands were trembling slightly. "Thank you," Alexander said to the judge, completely ignoring the tradition. "I believe that concludes the legal proceedings." Alexander's penthouse was even more impressive than Sarah had imagined. 40 floors above the city, with glass walls that offered a 360-degree view of Manhattan. But what impressed her most was the absolute silence. Not even the noise of the traffic reached up there, creating a feeling of floating in space. "Your things have been placed in the guest room," Alexander said, his words echoing in the spacious room. "You have access to the entire penthouse, except my office and my bedroom. Meals are prepared by the housekeeper, who comes 3 times a week. She also takes care of the cleaning." Sarah observed the environment around her. Everything was white, black, or gray, with straight lines and surfaces that shone like mirrors. There were no plants, photographs, or anything that suggested that a human being actually lived there. "What about the social events you mentioned?" she asked, trying to fill the uncomfortable silence. "There's a charity gala next Friday," Alexander replied, already heading towards what she imagined was his office. "An appropriate dress will be delivered by then. Just smile, greet people, and let me do the rest." In the days that followed, Sarah found that living with Alexander was like sharing space with a ghost. He left early in the morning and came back late at night, always wearing gloves, always keeping his distance. When they crossed paths in the hallway, he pressed himself against the wall to avoid any possibility of accidental contact. The loneliness was suffocating. Sarah tried to occupy her time exploring the penthouse, but each room was as sterile as a laboratory. She found herself talking to herself just to break the silence, her voice echoing in the spacious rooms as a reminder of her insignificance in that world of glass and steel. It was on the 4th day that she decided to make her first small rebellion. During a morning walk that Alexander had reluctantly allowed, she picked a red rose from a public garden. It was a simple flower, with some petals already wilted, but it carried the scent of real life. When she returned to the penthouse, she put the rose in a glass of water and left it on the kitchen table. Alexander found it that night, standing before the flower as if it were a bomb about to explode. "What is this?" he asked, his voice laden with a tension that Sarah hadn't heard before. "A rose," she replied simply. "I thought maybe it would bring some color to the place." Alexander stepped back a few paces, his eyes fixed on the flower. "Get rid of that immediately. We don't know where it's been, what kind of bacteria it might be carrying." "It's just a flower," Sarah said, surprised by the intensity of his reaction. "Nothing that comes from the outside is just anything," Alexander replied, his voice now trembling slightly. "Everything carries contamination, disease, death." Sarah watched him with a mixture of understanding and compassion. For the first time since she met him, She was seeing beyond the cold mask of the successful businessman. There was a deep pain there, a fear that went far beyond a simple phobia. "Okay," she said softly, picking up the rose. "I'll get rid of it." Alexander nodded curtly and turned away, but Sarah noticed that he paused at the entrance to the kitchen. Watching her remove the flower, there was something in his eyes that she couldn't quite decipher. Perhaps gratitude, perhaps something deeper. That night, Sarah lay in her lonely bed in the guest room, looking at the white ceiling and wondering what kind of prison she had gotten herself into. But she also thought about the expression on Alexander's face when he saw the rose, and wondered what kind of tragedy could turn a man into such an isolated island from everything that made life worth living. The charity gala was Sarah's first real test as Alexander's wife. The dress he had commissioned was a work of art in navy silk, which molded perfectly to her body and cost more than she earned in a year. When Alexander saw her for the first time, standing at the entrance of the penthouse in his impeccable tuxedo, something changed in his expression. For a split second, his defenses seemed to fail. "You are adequate," he said, but his voice carried a note that Sarah couldn't identify. The event was held in the main ballroom of a five-star hotel, filled with businessmen, politicians, and socialites. Sarah felt like an imposter amidst so many diamonds and conversations about million-dollar investments. Alexander introduced her as "my wife," with the same coldness he would use to discuss financial reports, but his hand remained firm on her back, always over the fabric of the dress, never touching her skin directly. It was during dinner that Sarah met Veronica Hayes, a woman of about 40 with predatory eyes and a smile that didn't reach her face. Veronica sat next to Alexander with a familiarity that made Sarah uncomfortable. "So, this is the famous mystery wife," Veronica said, her eyes scanning Sarah from head to toe. "I must admit, Alexander, your choice surprised me. I thought you were more discerning." "Veronica," Alexander replied, his voice carrying a warning tone that Sarah had never heard before. "Oh, relax," Veronica continued, taking a sip of champagne. "I'm just curious about how you two met. It must have been an interesting story, considering the circumstances." Sarah felt her blood run cold. There was something in the way Veronica spoke that suggested she knew more than she should about their marriage. Alexander became visibly tense, his hands clenching into fists on the table. "We met through business," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Sometimes the best relationships start unexpectedly." Veronica laughed, a sound that had nothing joyful about it. "Business, how interesting. And tell me, dear, how are you adjusting to married life? I imagine it's challenging, given Alexander's peculiar habits." The tension at the table became palpable. Alexander rose abruptly, extending his hand to Sarah. "Let's dance," he said, his voice making it clear that it wasn't an invitation but an order. The dance floor was crowded, but Alexander guided her to a more secluded area. He held her by the waist over the dress, maintaining a respectful distance, but Sarah could feel the tension in his muscles. "Who is Veronica?" Sarah asked as they moved to the rhythm of the music. "Someone who should mind her own business," Alexander replied, his eyes scanning the room as if looking for threats. "Does she know the truth about our marriage?" Alexander looked her in the eyes for the first time that night. "Veronica Hayes is a dangerous woman who collects secrets like other people collect jewels. She and I had history a few years ago." "What kind of history?" "The kind I'd rather forget," Alexander said, his voice taking on that familiar coldness. "She tried to blackmail me once. It didn't work out for her." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "And now she's interested in me." "In us," Alexander corrected. "Veronica doesn't do anything without a reason. If she's here asking questions, it's because she's looking for something she can use against me." The music ended, but Alexander didn't let go of her immediately. For a moment, they stood still in the middle of the dance floor, and Sarah had the strange feeling that he was fighting some internal impulse. His hands trembled slightly where they touched the fabric of her dress. "Alexander," she said softly, "are you okay?" He blinked as if waking from a trance and immediately stepped away. "Let's go home," he said abruptly. The ride back was made in tense silence. Sarah watched Alexander's profile in the reflection of the car window, noting how his hands remained clenched into fists. When they arrived at the penthouse, he disappeared, immediately into his office, leaving Sarah alone with her questions. In the days that followed, Alexander became even more distant. Sarah barely saw him, and when they crossed paths, he avoided even eye contact. It was then that she decided to try a different approach. On a rainy afternoon, she was organizing some books she had brought from home when Alexander entered the living room. He stopped when he saw her, his eyes fixed on the books spread across the coffee table. "Sorry," Sarah said, starting to gather them. "I was just—" "Leave them," Alexander said, his voice strangely soft. "How long has it been since you've rearranged something?" The question surprised her. "What do you mean?" "Your books. Do you arrange them by author, by genre, by color?" He approached slightly, observing the volumes with a curiosity that Sarah had never seen before. "By stories that make me feel less alone," Sarah replied honestly. Alexander was silent for a long moment, his eyes still fixed on the books. "I used to read," he said finally. Before what?" He looked up at her, and Sarah saw something break in his carefully controlled expression. "Before I decided it was safer not to touch anything that other people might have touched." Sarah felt her heart clench. "Alexander, what happened to you?" For a moment, she thought he was going to answer. His defenses seemed to be crumbling. His breathing became uneven, but then, as if an alarm had gone off in his mind, he recoiled sharply. "That's none of your business," he said, returning to his familiar coldness. "Our agreement doesn't include therapy." He turned to leave, but Sarah called out to him. "Alexander, wait." He stopped but didn't turn around. "I'm not Veronica," Sarah said softly. "I'm not here to hurt you or blackmail you. I'm here because you saved me. And maybe I can help you too." Alexander remained still for a long moment, his shoulders tense. When he finally turned around, his eyes were filled with a vulnerability that made Sarah want to wrap him in her arms. "You don't understand," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "I can't be helped. I can't be touched. I can't be loved." And with those words, he disappeared into his office, leaving Sarah alone with the painful realization that the man she had married was not only a prisoner of his own wealth, but of a fear so deep that it had consumed his ability to live. Sarah woke up the next morning with a determination she hadn't felt in weeks. Alexander's words echoed in her mind, "I can't be loved." It was as if he had handed her the key to understanding not only his fears, but also his devastating loneliness. During breakfast, she watched Alexander eat in silence, his gloved hands handling the utensils with surgical precision. He had created such an elaborate ritual to avoid contamination that even the act of feeding himself seemed like a medical operation. "Alexander," she said softly, "I need to go out today. I'm going to visit my father." He looked up, and Sarah noticed an immediate tension in his expression. "Robert can accompany you," he said. "It's not necessary, it's just a quick visit." Sarah. The way he said her name made her stop. It was the first time he had called her by her name since the wedding, and there was an intensity in his voice that she couldn't decipher. "Be careful." There was something in the way he spoke that made Sarah wonder if he was referring to more than just the usual dangers of the city. But when she tried to question him, Alexander had already retreated to his office. Her father's apartment seemed smaller than she remembered. David greeted her with a tight hug, and Sarah realized how much she had missed simple human warmth. "How are you, honey?" he asked, studying her face with concern. "You seem different." "I'm fine, Dad," Sarah lied, forcing a smile. "Alexander has been respectful." "Respectful isn't the same as happy," David observed. "You married a stranger. To save me, it kills me inside." Sarah held her father's hands, feeling tears threatening. "Dad, I'm learning about him. There's more to Alexander than meets the eye. He's not cruel, just hurt." "Hurt how?" "I don't know completely yet," Sarah admitted. "But he's afraid of touch, of human contact. He lives as if the world is too dangerous a place to risk feeling." David was quiet for a moment. You know, honey, sometimes the richest people are the poorest of all. They have everything except what really matters. When Sarah returned to the penthouse that afternoon, she found Alexander standing by the living room window, observing the city. He didn't turn around when she entered, but she noticed that his shoulders relaxed slightly. "Is your father all right?" he asked without turning around. "Yes," Sarah replied, surprised that he had asked. "He's fine." "Good." Sarah approached, stopping at a respectful distance. "Alexander, can I ask you something?" "That depends on the question." "What happened to your mother?" Alexander became completely still, as if he had been turned to stone. The silence stretched for so long that Sarah thought he simply wouldn't answer. "She died when I was 8 years old," he said finally, his voice so low that Sarah had to move closer to hear. "Hospital infection. Something that could have been avoided if the doctors had taken the proper precautions." "You were with her?" "Until the end." Alexander closed his eyes. "She was holding my hand when she died. I could feel the fever burning her skin, knew there was something wrong spreading through her body. And after I couldn't anymore what? Touch someone without feeling their death," Alexander whispered. "Without imagining all the invisible things that could be killing me, or that I could be passing on to someone else." Sarah felt her heart break. "Alexander, you were 8 years old. It wasn't your fault." "Rationally, I know that," he said, finally turning to look at her. "But rationality doesn't govern phobias. They're more primitive, more powerful than logic. And since then you never touched another person without gloves, never allowed anyone to touch me directly." He paused, his eyes meeting hers. "Until you." Sarah blinked, confused. "I've never touched you." "Not physically," Alexander said, his voice carrying a vulnerability she had never heard before. "But you're here, in this space that I created to protect myself from the world, and somehow you're reaching me anyway." Sarah's heart raced. "Alexander." "I dreamed about you last night," he continued, as if the words were being torn from him. "I dreamed that you touched me, and I wasn't afraid. I woke up terrified, not by the dream, but by how much I wanted it to be real." Sarah took a step towards him, and Alexander immediately recoiled, his hands trembling visibly. "See?" he said, his voice breaking. "I want to, but I can't. My body won't let me." "My mind won't let me." "What if we started slowly?" Sarah suggested gently. "It doesn't have to be physical touch. It can just be closeness." Alexander looked at her as if she had suggested something impossible. "Sarah, you don't understand. It's not just fear. It's panic. It's the feeling that I'm going to die if someone touches me." "Then let's not touch," Sarah said, moving one step closer. "Let's just be near." Alexander was clearly fighting an internal battle, his eyes closed, his breathing uneven. "I don't want to hurt you," he whispered. "You won't hurt me," Sarah replied, "but you're hurting yourself, living like this." She moved closer, stopping, just 3 feet away. Alexander opened his eyes and Sarah saw tears that he was trying to hold back. "I'm so afraid," he admitted. "I know," Sarah said gently, "but you don't have to be afraid alone." For a moment, they stood there, separated by just 3 feet, but Sarah felt as if an invisible bridge was being built between them. Alexander watched her as if she were a miracle he didn't dare believe existed. "Sarah," he said, his voice filled with an emotion she couldn't name, "I think I'm starting to fall in love with you, and that terrifies me more than anything I've ever felt." Alexander's confession hung in the air between them like a dangerous secret. Sarah felt her heart race, but before she could respond, Alexander's phone rang urgently. He answered it with trembling hands. "Hello?" His voice was tense. "What? When?" Alexander's face paled visibly. "No, don't do anything until I get there. Nothing, you hear me?" He hung up and turned to Sarah, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and despair. "We have a problem. Veronica Hayes is spreading rumors about our marriage. She's saying it's a financial arrangement to save your father from prison. Sarah felt her blood run cold. But how did she find out? Veronica has contacts everywhere. Private investigators, people in the legal system. She must have found out about your father's situation and connected the dots. Alexander began to pace back and forth, his anxiety palpable. This could ruin everything. The merger, my reputation, the deal I made with you. What does she want? Probably money or power. With Veronica, you never know. Alexander stopped pacing and looked at Sarah. There's something I need to tell. You, Veronica, and our history is more complicated than I let on. Sarah felt a knot in her stomach. What kind of complication? She was my therapist, Alexander said, his voice filled with shame. About 5 years ago, when my phobia was worse than ever, my doctor recommended that I seek psychological help. Veronica was considered one of the best phobia specialists in the country. And what happened? Alexander sat down heavily in a chair, burying his face in his gloved hands. She broke every code of professional ethics, started taking advantage of my vulnerability, said she loved me, that she could cure me if I trusted her completely. Sarah approached, feeling a growing anger towards the woman who had manipulated Alexander in his most fragile moment. She hurt you. She convinced me to try physical closeness, Alexander continued, his voice breaking. Said it was part of the treatment. But when I panicked, when I had an anxiety attack so severe that I almost passed out, she didn't stop. She kept going, saying I needed to overcome my fear. Sarah felt nauseous. God, Alexander, that's abuse. After that, she started blackmailing me, said she'd reveal my mental problems to the press if I didn't keep her on as a private consultant with an exorbitant salary. Alexander looked up, and Sarah saw a deep pain there. That's when I found out she had recorded our sessions, including the most intimate moments. Did you report her? I tried, but she's clever. Destroyed the evidence, denied everything. My word against hers, and I was just a rich businessman with mental problems. Alexander laughed bitterly. I ended up paying her to keep quiet for 3 years. Sarah knelt before Alexander's chair, maintaining a respectful distance, but looking directly into his eyes. And now she's back. She wants 50 million, Alexander said, or she'll reveal everything to the press. Our fake marriage, my phobia, the most intimate details of our sessions. Everything. What if we pay her? She'll never stop. People like Veronica always come back asking for more. Alexander closed his eyes. Sarah, I'm so sorry. I brought you into this. You don't deserve... Stop, Sarah said firmly. You're not to blame for what she did. She's the predator here, not you. Alexander looked at her in surprise. You're not angry at me? I'm angry at her, Sarah replied. And I'm angry at a system that allows people like her to take advantage of others in vulnerable moments. The phone rang again. Alexander answered it reluctantly. Alexander, darling, Veronica's voice sounded over the speakerphone, sweet as poisonous honey. I imagine you've received my message. What do you want, Veronica? Alexander asked, his voice tense. You know what I want. 50 million transferred to my account in the Cayman Islands by Friday. Or else Monday morning, every newspaper in the country will have a very interesting story about the fake marriage. Dive tycoon Alexander Sterling. You're bluffing. Am I? Veronica laughed. I have photos of your civil wedding, Alexander. No party, no family, just paid witnesses. I have financial records showing that you forgave a $250,000 debt the day after the wedding. And I have recordings of our sessions where you admit that you've never been able to touch a woman. Sarah saw Alexander recoil physically, as if he had been struck. What do you think will happen when your German partners find out that your perfect wife is just an actress hired to make you look normal? Veronica continued. That the great Alexander Sterling is so broken that he has to pay a woman to pretend to love him. You're sick, Alexander whispered. I'm realistic, Veronica replied. And you have until Friday to show me how realistic you are too. Oh, and Alexander, give my regards to your lovely wife. I hope she understands that she married a man who can never really touch her." The call ended, leaving a heavy silence in the air. Alexander was pale, trembling visibly. "She's right," he said, his voice almost inaudible. "I'll never be able to touch you. I'll never be able to be a real husband to you. I'll never be able to give you what you deserve." Sarah felt tears in her eyes, but not from sadness, from anger. "Alexander, look at me." He looked up, and Sarah saw all the pain and shame that Veronica had planted there. "She doesn't define who you are," Sarah said firmly. "She doesn't define what you can or can't do, and she definitely doesn't define what you deserve." "But she's right about one thing," Alexander said. "I can't touch you. I can't love you the way you deserve to be loved." Sarah took a deep breath, making a decision that would change everything. "Then let me show you that you're wrong." Sarah stood up slowly, her eyes never leaving Alexander's face. There was a determination growing inside her, a strength she didn't know she possessed. For weeks, she had been the victim of circumstances, passively accepting her fate. But now, seeing the man she loved being torn apart by Veronica's manipulations, something fierce awakened in her chest. "We're not paying her anything," Sarah said, her voice firm despite the tears that threatened to fall. Alexander looked at her as if she had gone mad. "Sarah, you don't understand. If she makes everything public—" "Then let her," Sarah interrupted, surprising both of them with her vehemence. "You know what Veronica wasn't expecting? That I wouldn't care what people thought about our marriage. But the merger, my reputation, your reputation isn't worth $50 million to a blackmailer," Sarah said, moving closer. "And it's definitely not worth your peace of mind." Alexander shook his head. "You don't understand what's at stake, my company, my employees, everything I've built." "And what have you built?" Sarah asked. "An empire based on fear, a life where you can't touch another person, where you live like a prisoner in your own home." The words hit Alexander like a slap. He stood up abruptly, walking to the window. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, I do," Sarah replied, following him. "I know you're so afraid to live that you'd rather be blackmailed for the rest of your life. I know you've convinced yourself that you don't deserve love because a sick woman made you believe it." "Stop," Alexander said, his voice breaking. "I'm not going to stop," Sarah continued, her own voice gaining strength. "Because someone needs to tell you the truth. Veronica didn't win when she abused you. She won when you let her define who you are. She won when you decided you would never try to connect with another person again." Alexander turned to her, his eyes shining with contained tears. "And what do you suggest I do? That I pretend I can be normal?" "I suggest you fight," Sarah said, her voice filled with emotion. "I suggest you stop hiding behind your fear and allow someone to love you." "I can't." "You can," Sarah said, taking a step towards him. "You can because I'm here and I'm not going to abandon you. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm not going to use your fears against you." Alexander recoiled, his hands trembling. "Sarah, you don't understand. When I panic, when the fear takes over, I can't breathe, I can't think, Then I'll be here to help you breathe," Sarah said simply. "I'll be here to remind you that you're safe." For a moment, Alexander seemed to consider her words. But then, as if a wall had come down, his expression closed off again. "No," he said, his voice returning to its cold, distant tone. "I'm not going to let you waste your life with someone broken like me. I'm going to pay Veronica. I'm going to keep our agreement for the rest of the year, and then you'll be free to find someone who can really love you." Sarah felt like she had been slapped. "You're giving up?" "I'm being realistic." "You're being a coward," Sarah said, her voice now filled with anger. "You're allowing Veronica to win. You're allowing her to destroy not only you, but also any chance of happiness we might have." Alexander was silent, but Sarah could see the internal struggle in his eyes. "You know what the difference is between us?" Sarah continued. "I had the courage to risk everything to save someone I love. You don't have the courage to even try to be saved." With those words, Sarah turned and left the room, leaving Alexander alone with his demons. In the next 2 hours, Sarah locked herself in her room, her mind working furiously. She wasn't going to accept defeat. She wasn't going to allow Veronica to destroy Alexander and get away with it. There was a way to fight, and Sarah was determined to find it. She grabbed her laptop and started researching. Veronica Hayes, psychologist, phobia specialist. Sarah found her professional website, her published articles, her impressive credentials. But she also found something else. Complaints to the psychology board, ethical lawsuits that had been mysteriously dismissed, a pattern of behavior that suggested Alexander hadn't been her only victim. Sarah made calls, sent emails, used every contact she had in the communication world. A former college classmate who now worked at a newspaper, a professor who knew private investigators, even the lawyer who had taken care of her father's documents. It was almost midnight when she finally emerged from the room. Alexander was in the kitchen, still dressed, staring at a cup of cold coffee. "I found 3 other women," Sarah said without preamble. Alexander looked up, confused. "What?" 3 other women that Veronica blackmailed. Businesswomen, politicians, a famous actress, all with similar stories. Therapy that turned into manipulation, secret recordings, financial blackmail. Alexander stood up slowly. "How did you—" "It doesn't matter how," Sarah interrupted. "What matters is that they're willing to testify, to expose Veronica for who she really is. Sarah, this is dangerous. Veronica has connections, power, and we have the truth," Sarah said. "And we have something she doesn't have. People who care about each other." Alexander looked at her for a long moment. "Why are you doing this?" "Because I love you," Sarah said simply. "Because you deserve to be free. Because Veronica doesn't have the right to destroy lives and get away with it." Alexander closed his eyes and Sarah saw tears streaming down his face. "I'm so afraid," he whispered. "I know," Sarah replied. "But you don't have to face this alone. Not anymore." Alexander opened his eyes, and Sarah saw something she hadn't seen before. Hope. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. Sarah smiled for the first time in days. "I need you to trust me. I need you to be brave for one more day. And I need you to give me permission to fight for us." Alexander nodded slowly. "I trust you." "So tomorrow we're going to end this," Sarah said. "We're going to confront Veronica, and we're going to do it together." She turned to leave, but Alexander's voice stopped her. "Sarah," she turned around. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "for fighting for me when I couldn't fight for myself." Sarah smiled, her heart filling with a fierce determination. "Always," she said. "I'll always fight for you." As she headed to her room, Sarah knew that the next day would be decisive. Veronica had underestimated one thing: the power of a woman who loves enough to fight any opponent, no matter how powerful they are. The next morning arrived charged with electric tension. Sarah had woken up before dawn, finalizing the details of her plan with a precision that surprised even herself. At 8 in the morning, she and Alexander were in his office, surrounded by documents, recordings, and the testimony of 3 courageous women who had decided to face Veronica. "She'll be here at 10, Alexander said, checking his watch for the 10th time. "Are you sure this is going to work?" "I have to be," Sarah replied, adjusting the small recorder she had hidden in her blouse. "Veronica is arrogant. She'll want to brag. She'll want you to know exactly how she defeated you, and when she does, we'll have her." The intercom buzzed. Robert announced Veronica's arrival in his usual neutral voice, but Sarah could feel the tension even through the sound system. Veronica entered the office like a conquering queen, wearing a red dress that cost more than Sarah's annual salary. Her smile was predatory, her eyes gleaming with the anticipation of victory. "Alexander, darling," she said, her voice dripping, with false sweetness. "And the lovely Sarah. How nice to see you both together." "Veronica," Alexander replied, his voice firmer than Sarah expected. "Let's get this over with." "Of course," Veronica said, sitting comfortably in a chair without being invited. 50 million, immediate transfer, and I disappear from your life forever." "And if I refuse?" Alexander asked. Veronica laughed, a sound that made Sarah shiver. "Then tomorrow the whole country will know that the great Alexander Sterling is a man so pathetic that he can't even touch his own wife. They'll know that he paid a woman to pretend to love him, because no one could ever love someone so broken. Sarah saw Alexander recoil physically, his hands trembling. It was exactly the reaction Veronica expected, and Sarah knew this was the crucial moment. "You know, Veronica," Sarah said, her voice calm and controlled, "there's one thing you never understood about Alexander." Veronica turned to her, her eyes narrowing. "Ah, the wife is going to speak. How adorable." "You always thought he was weak because he's afraid of physical contact," Sarah continued, ignoring Veronica's sarcastic tone. "But you were wrong. He's the strongest person I've ever met." "Strong?" Veronica scoffed. "He can't even shake a hand without panicking." "He built an empire despite his fear," Sarah said. "He saved my family when he didn't have to. He protected me when I was a stranger. And more importantly, he survived you." Veronica's smile faltered slightly. "He hasn't survived me. He's still mine, can't you see? I still make him dance to my tune." "Not anymore," Sarah said, and gave a discreet signal. The office doors opened and 3 women entered. Veronica paled as she recognized them: Carla Mendez, the businesswoman, Julia Santos, the politician, and Marina Oliveira, the actress. All victims of Veronica's methods. "Hello, Veronica," said Carla, her voice sharp as a knife. "Long time no. See? What are you doing here?" Veronica stammered, her composure finally cracking. "We're here to tell our story," said Julia. "The story of how you abused your position, recorded private sessions without consent, and blackmailed us for years." "You can't prove anything," Veronica said, but her voice betrayed nervousness. "We can," Marina interjected, placing a stack of documents on the table. "Bank records, threatening emails, even some of your recordings that we managed to recover. It's all here." Sarah watched Veronica process the information, seeing the exact moment when reality hit her. But the psychologist still had one last card to play. "This doesn't change anything," Veronica said, trying to regain her composure. "I still have the recordings of Alexander. I can still destroy your fake marriage." "No, you can't," Sarah said calmly, "because our marriage isn't fake anymore." Veronica blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" Sarah looked at Alexander, who was watching the scene with a mixture of admiration and something she could finally name as love. "I fell in love with my husband," Sarah said, her voice filled with true emotion. "And he with me. You can expose how we started, Veronica, but you can't change what we've become." "That's ridiculous," Veronica said, but there was less conviction in her voice. "He can't even touch you." "You're right," Alexander said, finally finding his voice. "I can't touch her, not yet. But that doesn't mean I don't love her. That doesn't mean our marriage isn't real." He stood up, walking to Sarah. "You thought my phobia made me weak, Veronica, but it made me selective. I can't touch just anyone, but that makes it even more special when I want to touch someone." Alexander stopped before Sarah, his eyes shining with a determination she had never seen before. "I love my wife," he said, his voice echoing in the office. "I love her courage, her kindness, her strength. And if the whole world knows that our marriage started as a business deal, so be it. Because it's become so much more than that." Veronica looked around, realizing she had lost control of the situation. "You can't do this to me," she said, her voice now clearly desperate. "We're not doing anything to you," Carla said. "We're just making sure you don't do anything to anyone else." "The authorities have already been notified," Julia added. "Your professional records will be reviewed. Your victims will finally have justice." Veronica stood up abruptly, her face contorted with rage. "You'll regret this," she spat. "All of you." "No," Sarah said calmly. "You're the one who's going to regret it, because finally your victims have become survivors." Veronica stormed out of the office, but her power had been broken. Sarah watched Alexander collapse into his chair, his hands trembling not from fear, but from relief. "It's over," he whispered. "It's really over." "Yes," Sarah said, approaching him. "It's over." Alexander looked up at her, and Sarah saw something new there, genuine hope. "Sarah," he said, his voice filled with a vulnerability she had learned to love. "I want to try." "Try what?" touch you," he said, slowly removing one of his gloves. "I don't know if I can do it. I don't know if I won't panic, but I want to try." Sarah felt tears in her eyes. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure I love you," Alexander replied. "I'm sure you make me want to be brave." Slowly, his hand trembling, Alexander extended his bare hand towards Sarah's face. She remained completely still, barely daring to breathe. When the tips of his fingers touched her cheek, Alexander closed his eyes, his breathing becoming uneven. For a moment, Sarah thought he was going to pull back. But then he opened his eyes and smiled, a genuine, free smile that she had never seen before. "I'm not afraid," he whispered, marveling. "For the first time in 26 years, I'm not afraid." Sarah covered his hand with hers, and Alexander didn't recoil. Instead, he pulled her closer until their foreheads touched. "I love you," he said, the words finally free of the chains that Veronica had forged. "I love you too," Sarah replied. And when they kissed, it was as if the whole world had realigned. 6 months later, Sarah was standing on the balcony of the penthouse watching the sunset over Manhattan. Alexander approached from behind, his arms wrapping around her in a hug that still surprised them with its naturalness. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice warm against her ear. "I'm thinking about how funny it is," Sarah replied, leaning back against his chest. "I married you to save my father. I ended up saving you too." "You saved us both," Alexander corrected. "You taught me that love isn't something you catch or lose. It's something you choose every day." Sarah smiled, intertwining her fingers with his. "And you taught me that sometimes the best things in life start with a leap in the dark." "So," Alexander said, turning her to face him, "are you ready for the next leap?" "What next leap?" Alexander smiled, pulling a small box from his pocket. "This one. I know we're already married, but I wanted to do it right this time. I wanted to ask for your hand because I love you, not because I need you." Sarah laughed through her tears. "Alexander Sterling, are you proposing to me?" "I'm asking you to marry me again," he said, opening the box to reveal a ring that captured the light of the sunset. "This time for love." "Yes," Sarah said without hesitation. 1,000 times yes." As Alexander slid the ring onto her finger, his hands didn't tremble once. They had found in each other not only love, but the cure for their deepest wounds. And in the silence of the penthouse that had once been a prison, they danced under the stars, finally free to touch, to love, to live.